Hi everyone, my name is Patty Talarczyk. I'm a math teacher at Mentor High School in Mentor, Ohio. And this is the first part of a presentation I have put together on using Desmos Polygraph and Desmos Activity Builder for geometry class. So part of this session focuses on Polygraph, and that's going to be in this first video. If you aren't familiar with Polygraph, it is kind of like a game of Guess Who. You see these, well, students would see these graphs showing different images of whatever you would like them to be, essentially. And as long as a student can type, they can use it because they're going to be asking one another yes or no questions. They're randomly paired up with other students in the classroom. And it's a really great class activity to promote vocabulary usage. The graphs and images are called the suspects, just like in the game of Guess Who, you have the suspects that you're trying to figure out. So that's the general overview of what Polygraph looks like. And some of my personal suggestions for using this in class involve coaching students through generation of lists of good words or bad words. And depending on your grade level of students, you have the maturity of your students or what have you, maybe you come up with these lists on your own first, or maybe you just do a little pre-planning of what things you know you want on the list and then have the students try to come up with those on their own. So one thing you could do for scoring or participation points, if you like to do that in your classroom, would be to encourage students to avoid using any words on your bad word list and to encourage usage of words that are on the good word list. And once we look at an actual example, I'll revisit that concept and give you an idea more of what I'm talking about. So for some examples that I have here, the first two, circle transformations and identifying transformations, are two polygraphs that I made myself. And then angle relationships is one that I found through searching, which is a whole separate topic of how to search for good Desmos activities. So let's, for now, just click on circle transformations. And when you look at an already made polygraph, if you scroll down to the bottom of this page, you see the different graph choices. There are always 16 total. So in this particular graph set, I purposely created circles that have undergone different transformations. So we have the concentric circles, which are dilation only. I have a pair of congruent circles that were translated. And depending on how you teach, perhaps you would look at this as being internally tangent circles or externally tangent circles. Maybe you look at this particular graph as being a dilation plus a translation or a dilation that is centered somewhere other than the center of the circle. So all of that is just options up to you depending on what you are trying to achieve with your personal polygraph. And when you play the game, so what I was talking about with having good words and bad words is that when you look at a class session, you can look at this live during the class period, and as you can see here, you can look at it after the fact for grading purposes. So, for example, this student pair said, "Is it an eyeball?" which is probably something that would not be on the good word list. Bigger than the blue, maybe, because that gets a dilation. Cut down the middle by the axis is good. It could be a little better. We don't really have too many bad words here, but going into each other could be refined to say intersect, such as the student down here. Quadrant 2 is good to talk about the quadrants. So essentially those good word and bad word lists that you make at the beginning, you could assign point values, such as every time a student uses a bad word, they get a -1, and every time they use a good word, they get a +1, or something like that to somehow track classwork participation points. The polygraph also shows you per student. This is set to anonymous mode right now, but per student you can see how many times they played and how many correct versus losing rounds they had. Desmos does a pretty good job of rotating which student is the question asker versus the question answerer. And one other thing to mention is that polygraphs default include these questions for kind of a time filler in between rounds. What question could you ask to distinguish between these two graphs? And then it kind of just picks two graphs from your set of 16 suspects to show the student to compare. And then it also does kind of the same thing, but this time it says choose two graphs from this set that would be difficult to distinguish with one question and to explain why. And as you can see, a lot of people didn't really do a great job of explaining their reasoning, but this would be a good opportunity for you to have students revisit the work that they did on a previous day and talk about how they could improve what they're doing in the other attempts of using the session. So that was circle transformations. I'm just going to briefly show you these others so you can see what they look like. Identifying transformations, I have a series of right triangles. I purposely made them right triangles so that it would eliminate an element of possible discussion for students. So they can't ask, is it right, as a way to narrow down. I wanted to force them to focus on which transformation was present. So that is another way to approach that. Angle relationships is a great one for looking at your different angle pair relationships, vertical angles, adjacent, linear pair, corresponding, things like that. And the teacher who made this one, as you can see, has a pretty wide variety of choices. Depending on your grade level, maybe you would want to narrow this down to a little more restricted set of angle pairs if you're really trying to focus on certain aspects. So the last thing I wanted to cover related to the polygraphs is things to keep in mind when you're making your own. So it's a good idea, because you have to come up with 16 suspects, to have a plan in mind of whether you're going to make your own graphs or import images, and what your goals are to help you come up with your 16 subjects or suspects. So do you want there to be 2 of each kind of thing? Do you want there to be any particular similarities or differences you have control over? So like, for example, how my triangle example had all right triangles. That was something I wanted to control so that it wouldn't be a discussion point. So I want to show you briefly, when you're making your own, how to go about this. So the way you would do it is in Desmos. You would first sign in. So you're going to teacher.desmos.com. And you're going to sign in with Google. And once you are signed in with Google, you can go to Custom. And once you're in your Custom screen, you have New Polygraph or New Activity. So let's click New Polygraph. And for your polygraph, it just brings you to a screen first where you have 16 boxes. Each of these boxes is going to be one of your suspects. You can toggle the grid lines on or off depending on what you want to show with the graph. So if I wanted to put a circle, like I did in the previous example, I can type my equation of a circle, and it appears on the graph, and I could toggle my grid lines on or off if I wanted to. So you can see a preview of how it's going to look in these little thumbnails. You can also see the larger image. So that's one thing, one way that you can add a graph is if it's an actual graph. Another thing you can do is import an image. So to do that, in your creation window, add item, image, and I'm going to just put in a screenshot of an angle pair, which I know is not related to the circle, but it kind of gets things done here. And you can see how this image is movable and resize. You can resize a bit. Depending on your type of image, the resolution sometimes has some sizing issues with blurriness, but that's kind of just depends on what kind of picture you're putting in there. So after you've filled in all 16, then you can go ahead and move on to the details, which is especially important for if you're making your activity public. You can type a brief description and give some suggested teacher notes for other teachers on using your polygraph. All right, so that is the extent of what I wanted to cover with the polygraph part of this video series. So part 2 will cover using Activity Builder related to geometry-specific Desmos activities. Thanks for watching.